Okay, everybody, we're going to try to do things a little bit differently. No DM advice or crafting tips or anything like that. And I can't even promise that this video is going to be entertaining, but I can promise it's going to be informative. What we're going to do is we're going to trace the evolution of the 5th edition fighter throughout the D&D Next playtest. I have all the playtest documents and the alpha version of the player's handbook, and I also went ahead and used the wayback machine to retrieve a whole bunch of articles from the old D&D forums. So with those things together and a few videos that were posted on YouTube, we're going to trace how the design team went about giving us the fight that they have right now. And throughout this process, there are like two key elements that we should keep an eye on, right? The first one is this sort of design puzzle around the fighter, that people who like playing fighters like two very different things. Some people like the really simple, straightforward class, and other people like the really tactically complex fighter. Some people just like, to pick up a sword and shield and just bash things and be able to take a lot of damage. And other people love being able to manipulate and move around the battlefield and do all sorts of nifty tricks. So this one class has to incorporate both of those types of players. Of course, the answer is obvious in retrospect, right? We have the champion and the battle master. But how they reach that decision is really interesting to watch. The second thing we want to keep in mind is the fighter needs something that makes it unique, right? There are a whole bunch of martial classes, the monk, the lesser extent the rogue, the ranger, the paladin. All these characters mix it up in melee. But the fighter needs something that makes them special, that makes them the very best at this sort of thing. What is their unique defining mechanic? And with those two things in mind, let's just, I guess the best place to start is the very beginning. All right, so just really briefly, we want to go over the very earliest document that we have for D&D Next. This was in March 2012, a full 2 months before the first playtest is released, and it gives a design overview of what they need from this new edition of the game. The first goal is they need a reunification through common understanding. At this point, the whole role-playing community was really fractured. Some people are playing all sorts of editions, Pathfinder, and so they need to get them all back together, and they're going to do it through understanding what the core elements is, what's the most basic parts of this game, and how to incorporate them in a prominent role. Anyone who's ever played any version of D&D must be able to recognize and understand these important elements. Things like hit points, armor class. The second goal is reunification through diversity. And this is sort of a subtle point that all the other editions of D&D, they had things that they really excel at. Like 2nd edition was great at open-ended play, problem solving, imaginative, theory of their mind. 3rd edition was the most complete version of the game. It modeled the universe as well as anything could. There was a rule for every single thing, and people loved that complexity and detail. 4th edition was the tactical game, where it was like a one-on-one miniature war game almost. And so this new edition of D&D had to be able to incorporate all of those different play styles in one game. They need to make a big tent RPG. And the third goal was reunification through accessibility. What this means is that really the biggest problem with D&D is that it has a huge barrier of entry. You have to learn a whole bunch of rules in order to get involved. And if they're going to ask people to put aside their old RPGs and learn a new system, or just begin the hobby in general, they need to make it as easy as they could. So they needed to make it relatively simple to learn the core parts of the game. So after that, in April 2012, 1 month before the first playtest packet is released, we get some class design goals. This is what each and every class needs to achieve. So the class needs to be recognizable to anybody who has ever played D&D. That is, if I just name some class features, you need to be able to recognize what that class is. So for example, if I say this person, they cast divine spells, they turn the undead, they wear heavy armor, like, oh, that's a cleric. So just solely based on the abilities, you need to be able to recognize this class in the canon of D&D. And the second thing is every class needs to have an element that makes it unique. And this is sort of an interesting point, that there is a distinct difference between balance and symmetry. And a lot of times folks get those confused. Balance means that you feel just as happy as anyone else playing can play, right? If you're playing that you love playing tanks, when you play a tank, you feel just as happy and fulfilled as someone who loves playing the support character feels playing the support class. Symmetry is when all these things sort of look the same, they have the same mechanical outcome. And that's something that 4th edition really struggled from. The only real difference between a wizard and a fighter was the name and flavor text. And this third one is classes should in some way relate to archetypical characters. Fighters are probably the most popular character in all fantasy literature and mythology, and so it needs to incorporate all those story elements into this class. The mechanics need to reflect their story elements. And then finally, we get some interesting things about the fighter itself. What do we need this fighter to do in the game? And this is a great touchstone. They're going to come back to this document again and again and again as their sort of roadmap. This is a great thing to do in project management, to have a touch point, so you always know whether or not you're maintaining your goals. So the first point is the fighter needs to be the best at fighting. This is probably an obvious point, but when it comes to which class is the best at dealing out damage, which class is the best going toe-to-toe with monsters, taking punishment and keep on going, it's got to be the fighter. The second point is the fighter draws on training and experience, not magic. So the fighter is doing all these extraordinary things through their own ability, through their own physical might and skill and prowess. They don't have magic coursing through their blood. But at the same time, this fighter exists in a world of fantasy, myth, and legend. These are sort of counterpoints. What this means is that while the fighter is not magical, what they're doing is still outstanding, extraordinary, and heroic, right? It's epic. Beowulf slew Grendel by tearing his arm off. He later killed a dragon almost single-handedly. That is excellent. You can expect the fighters to do fairly mundane things with weapon, but with such overwhelming skill that none can hope to stand against them. The fourth goal is that the fighter is versatile. It means the fighter needs to be great at all the weapons and all the armor. The fighter is the toughest character. Again, who's the best at taking punishment and keep on going? It's the fighter. They have high AC, they have great saving throws, and they have the ability to withstand the most punishment. And 6, this is a key point here, and that anyone's familiar with the game will know this, that traditionally we have this linear fighter and quadratic wizard. And that means that at a high level play, they're really imbalanced. And they acknowledge this right off the bat here. Too often in D&D, the high level fighter is the flunky to a high level wizard. Ugh. So how are they going to know if we balance it successfully? How are they going to know that the high level fighter and the high level wizard are equal? Well, a wizard might be able to annihilate a small army of orcs with a volley of fireballs or a cone of cold, but the fighter does the same thing, sword blow by sword blow, taking down waves of orcs each round. Okay, so we have an equivalent in just damage output maybe? But even more than that, if a wizard unleashes every spell at his or her disposal at the fighter absorbs the punishment, throws off the effects, and keeps on fighting. So they're also able to withstand massive amounts of things that the wizard can put out those high levels. All right, so now we have some good stake posts in the ground. We have a real framework, so we know what to look for when we're building our fighter. And that brings us to the first playtest packet in May 24th, 2012. All right, so here is our first playtest packet. When they released these, they were only pre-generated characters, and they went through levels 1 through 3. But we can still piece together what's happening here. So right off the bat, we see that it has a D12 hit die, and that's kind of strange. But it's not really a D12, it's really a D10 hit die for the fighter. It just gets bumped up because this fighter happens to be a dwarf. The second thing to note is the armor class is only 15 for chainmail. And the reason this is a little bit lower than it is right now is because at this point in the game, there is no base attack bonus. When you roll the D20 to see that if you hit, all you add is your relevant ability, strength. So even though the math in 5th edition is pretty flat, right now it's even flatter. And what do we get for being a fighter? This is our first class feature. We get proficiency with weapons and armor. That's not going to change. We always get all proficiencies with weapons and armor. And our class feature really is our weapon focus. What the fighter does is they gain a +2 bonus to damage. All right, cool. So the fighter, what they're doing, they're dealing the most damage, and they're wearing heavy armor and maybe carrying a shield too. Great. Over here, this is something that's interesting in this first version of the playtest packet. We have a background and a theme. Now, these are both optional systems. These are things that were not considered part of the core of D&D Next. These were optional rules that people could choose to play with. And what a background does is it gives you skills. So you would be able to use these bonuses in place of your relevant ability. So instead of making a charisma check to intimidate somebody, you can sometimes just add your intimidate bonus instead. The second thing to note is this theme. Now, themes are a collection of feats, and those are, again, an optional system that you could choose to play with. And so what this theme, the Slayer, does is it gives you a benefit called the Reaper, that when you miss with an attack, you can still deal damage equal to your ability score. But again, this is an optional system. This is not part of the fighter core. At level 2, this fighter gets Fighter Surge. Twice per day, you can take 2 actions on your turn. That sounds pretty familiar, right? But note that it's twice per day, not once per long rest. They hadn't invented long rest yet. And there's no restriction about doing it twice in a row, which is kind of interesting. And then at level 3, what do you get for being a fighter? Nothing. So you get Cleave right here, but this is part of your theme. This is a feat you get from this optional rule system, that once a day you can reduce an enemy to 0 hit points, and if you do that, you can get an extra swing. And note how they worded this here. It is not as a bonus action, but as part of the same action. Bonus actions wouldn't get invented until way, way late in the playtest process. All right, so that is our first pass at the fighter, and let's see what people thought about this. Okay, so to review, we got our D10 hit die, we got proficiency in all weapons and armor, and we got 2 optional systems. We have a background system, which gives you skills, which replace your ability score rolls, and you have themes, which give you access to some feats. As for the fighter itself, at first level, you get a +2 bonus to damage. At second level, you get an extra action twice per day. And that's all we have so far. And so what did people think of this fighter? Well, our first pass, we get this article, June 25th, 2012, from Mike Mearls. And people want to see more choices in combat, particularly for the fighter. Just doing more damage, that really wasn't enough. And they're going to address this by introducing a maneuver system that the players can access using themes. Right now, the maneuvers that fighter got were all pretty passive, right? They didn't give them a choice. If you miss, you automatically can deal some damage. If you happen to reduce somebody to 0, then you can make an extra attack. That's not really a great choice. And specifically on the fighter, people want to see more active choices, and people also aren't seeing a unique defining mechanic or ability for the fighter. Now, remember, this is something that we talked about. We need to have something for the fighter that makes it special, that sets it apart from all the other martial classes. And whatever this is, it needs to be separate from the maneuver system, because if the maneuver system is going to be through feats, then anybody can do it. And we get one other article in July 2012 about combat superiority. So here is where they really address the thing with the fighter and specifically, right? The fighter dealt out the damage that they wanted, right? But they still want more options. So their first thought was, okay, we already talked about this. Just give the class an additional theme. And if they have 2 themes, then they get more maneuvers. Because remember, these themes are just chains of feats. But that's not going to be satisfactory because it didn't address the basic concept. What makes this class unique from all others? So if they can't just give it an additional theme, they can't just give it more feats, they need something else. And their new mechanic, they're going to call combat superiority. Sound familiar? So combat superiority essentially is just going to be, this mechanic is going to represent a fighter's combat skill. A player can get a die to represent the fighter's skill and like sort of an energy that they have. And you can spend this die to do initially 2 things. You can either do more damage or you can reduce the damage that you receive. So that's pretty cool, right? So even at the most fundamental level, you have a choice. You can be more offensive and more defensive. And that's pretty easy for even a new player to pick up, right? Oh, just sometimes you can add this extra roll. Awesome. But this combat superiority system is going to drain some of the elements they originally intended for the maneuver system. So if combat superiority is going to let you do other things too, so that just adding and subtracting damage is the real simple option, but we can do other stuff too. We can have other combat superiority maneuvers that require you to expend dice without rolling them. And these might be more difficult maneuvers to complete, things that can make people push or trip or maneuver people around. Bethany, the shield specialist, might spend a die to reduce the amount of damage an ally takes or turn an attack into a miss. That's a cool use of combat superiority that's not just that basic, that simple option. But if they're going to allow things like that, that combat superiority system is going to drain away some of the elements they originally intended for maneuvers and themes. So if the fighter is also going to do these cool combat tricks, then all those cool combat tricks can't just be themes. So with that in the mind, they're going to have to do something else. So maybe they can have the fighter be a better version of these maneuvers that everyone else can have access to. The fighter might have a combat superiority option that allows for 2-weapon fighting that is better than the version offered by a feat. So that could be the thing that makes the fighter special. Everyone has access to the maneuvers, but the fighter has these supercharged maneuvers. And just one other thing of note, that we get one other article that talks about the fighter before the next playtest packet comes out. And that was that the call for fighter to have more options. That call spanned play preference, length of time playing D&D, and every other category they tracked. So no matter how long or what edition you were playing, this idea for more options, the same number of people wanted that, which is pretty interesting. All right, so after this last article comes GenCon 2012, where we get the second playtest packet released. So let's take a look at that. Okay, so this playtest packet came out August 13th, 2012, and let's see what our fighter has this time. Well, it goes all the way up to level 5, so that's pretty cool. And something else that's different right off the bat is we get an ability score adjustment. So in this iteration of the playtest, when you choose to be a fighter, you get a bump to one of your stats, which is pretty outstanding. They changed the name of the theme to specialty. So, but still just a chain of feats that you can get. And we also see that in addition to going to level 5, we also have a base weapon attack bonus now. So instead of just adding your strength, you can add this number 2. Or that number 2, I should say. And we have our expertise dice that we knew this was coming, and now let's see how this plays out. So at level 1, we get combat superiority. And so you get this single die, your expertise die, and you get it back at the start of each of your turns. So you always have this die. And this die can fuel your maneuvers. And you start with 2 maneuvers, the Deadly Strike and Parry. Which we talked about. The Deadly Strike is the one that just lets you add extra damage. And the Parry one is the one that lets you remove damage. So also at level 1, you get a fighting style. And at this point, a fighting style is a chain of pretty much buffed up feats. So there's a bunch of different fighting styles you can choose from. The Duelist, the Protector, the Sharpshooter, the Slayer. And they give you like I said, a chain of buffed up feats essentially. So Sharpshooter will give you Precise Shot, Snapshot, and Shift. And this gives you at fixed levels. That is, once you choose your fighting style at first level, you are stuck with it all the way up until 5th level. And so let's look at a few of these. Let's look at Precise Shot and Snapshot. Actually, you know what, real fast, we're going to look at Glancing Blow. Once per turn, when you miss a creature with a weapon attack, but roll at least a 10 on the d20, you can spend an expertise dice to turn the miss into a Glancing Blow. Now, people don't like this, and they're going to change it, and we'll keep an eye on that. So Precise Shot and Snapshot are archery feats, right? When you take an action other than making an attack, you can spend a single die to make a ranged attack. And you can use that die instead of your normal die to do the damage. Okay, cool. Precise Shot. When you make a ranged attack that has half cover, 3/4 cover, you can add your expertise dice to your attack roll. Awesome. And so let's compare these versions of the fighter's archery feats to the ones that are standard in the game. The standard for everybody through the maneuver system. So specialties, this replaces the theme, right? So this is another optional system that you can choose to play within the game, and they're essentially collections of feats that you can get. But they're not just martial feats. You can have the Alkalite one that gives you some spells or stuff like that. But for the sake of comparison, let's look at the archer specialty, and see how these compare to the things you get as a fighter if you choose that fighting style. So Rapid Shot lets you attack twice instead of once, which is pretty good, but all the damage is halved, so you're trading accuracy for damage. And at level 3, you get Sniper. So, you can choose an action to focus in and then get advantage. So those are both like kind of useful and situationally, but they're not nearly as good as what the fighter gets. The fighter is getting beefed up, really special things to make them the best archer, even better than a ranger who might take the archer specialty. So let's go back and see how this version of the playtest went over with folks. Okay, so just to reiterate in that playtest packet, well, we lost our fighting surge. We no longer have that ability to take 2 actions twice per day. But we got an ability bump at first level, and we also gained a weapon attack bonus that we can use in place of our strength roll. So instead of rolling the d20 and adding our strength, we roll the d20 and add our base attack bonus instead. We still have these 2 optional systems, the background that gives you access to some skills, and this should say specialty, which gives you access to feats. But as for what the fighter gets, at level 1 they get their combat superiority, which is they get this die that refreshes each and every turn to fuel maneuvers. And you get a fighting style, which gives you access to extra maneuvers. Everyone has the base, extra damage or reduced damage, and then you can also get these special feats on top of it. Level 2, you get nothing. Level 3, you get a new maneuver. And level 5, you get a new maneuver from your fighting style. All right, so right after this, there was a panel at GenCon called Creating the Core. If you haven't watched this video, I'll link it below the subscribe button. It's really fascinating. They tell you, it's with Rodney Thompson, Mike Mearls, and Jeremy Crawford, and they give their whole overarching goal for the core of the game. We want a really simple core that have lots of different modules that they can plug into. And they also give a few interesting points about their class goals at the end, because they do a Q&A session. And something that really stood out to me was that the fighter needs to be the best expression of the class for people who like fighters. So when they're designing the fighter, they're designing it for people who love playing that class, not for people who like playing bards. The bard needs to be the best for people who love playing the bard, and the fighter needs to be the best for people who love playing the fighter. Interestingly, they also hinted that they think they worked out how the fighter is going to work. They were really happy with this maneuver system. They think it is really outstanding. They think people are going to love it. And they also point out that the regular maneuvers as feats, that's an optional module. Like, remember the specialties? That can plug into the core of the game. It's not essential. So it gives everybody an option to scale and complexity. So that's how they thought they hit those two big goals at the start, that it could appeal both to simple or players who like the simple class and the complex class by giving you the option of additional feats. And the fighters' core maneuvers in their fighting style, that's what's going to make them unique. That's what's going to make them stand apart from everybody else. And you see this right in about a little bit later. Mike Mearls on September 24th writes that he's quite happy or even relieved that the fighter changes have gone over really better, right? People really like expertise. They love the idea of getting that die each and every round to do cool things with. The fighter went from being the lowest rated class to by far the highest. It hit the goals they set from the beginning, remember? The mechanic that can scale in complexity. You can choose the attack. You can choose the simple option of doing extra damage or reducing damage, or you can choose to do these fancier maneuvers. That feels right in terms of the story. The fighter has this extra power, or they can spend some energy to do a really cool thing. And it speaks to what the class is good at, namely fighter, right? So, and here's what's interesting, right? Unless things change, the fighter has hit the targets we aimed for. So why would they change it? If it's doing what they want it to do, this should be the fighter that we expect to see at the very end. But it's not. Something else changed that made the fighter go from being the highest rated to the lowest rated. And it wasn't the fighter. Everything else around the fighter changed. And we'll see how that played out in the third playtest packet, which will probably